Well, hello, and welcome to the Astrology Channel. This is the first episode of our spin-off series of our daily horoscopes because there are only 7 days in the week and the outer planets get left out very often, and that makes us not pay attention to them as much as we should. So we thought about starting a series where we'll be paying attention to the outer planets through the bounds. And who better to get us started than Pluto retrograding back into Capricorn this Monday. So let's get right to it. Here's what we have happening as Pluto retrogrades back into Capricorn. We have Pluto, of course, in Capricorn, in the Sun's decan and Mars's terms, with no inner planet within orb. And we're using a 3-degree orb for this, if you're curious. And this is all happening during a balsamic moon that is trine to Pluto, and Pluto will be sextile to Saturn, which rules Capricorn.
Capricorn's the accepted way of doing things, the more maybe conservative way of approaching things, and how we maintain those structures, those institutions. And Pluto tends to create horror stories around those topics, we'll say. So the horror that may or may not be based in reality around those things. So like the horror of the deep state or the oppressive bureaucratic machine and our relationship with that. So I think we'll be seeing some conclusions to those stories and moving on, hopefully, to new horror stories, I guess. We're maybe tired of these horror stories, but I think what makes it easier to interpret on a certain level, because it's so unconfigured to other things, at least for the ingress chart, it's maybe worth noting that the moon is right at the end of its balsamic phase. It's basically invisible, has no light of its own. There is like a closing out of the story.
Yeah, I think it's also interesting because in my newsletter not too long ago, if you don't know, I write newsletters where I spend some extra time talking about a particular configuration that I find interesting. And I was talking about the sun ingress into Virgo, and I was using the chart cast from the celestial equator. And from that, we actually got Capricorn rising. So not very different from what we were having here. So Pluto going back into Capricorn is going back into the first house of the month, per se, from like a global perspective. I find that interesting because it really just brings those topics to the forefront. Like we are really wrestling with like the end and the decay of some of these structures that we've talked about. And this is what I have going on for the image too, especially thinking about the Virgo seasonness of it all. Pluto, the Lord of Death, just vomiting an ocean of fire ants on top of a pile of gold. I feel like the answer, the mercurial thing, it's like there's many problems and they're very tiny and they're gnawing away at all of these financial structures and the topic of resources and things like that. And one big thing that I talked about in my newsletter actually was that Saturn being in Pisces is directly in opposition to the season itself, bringing a lot of these Virgo issues of scrutinizing and really getting to the bottom of the tiny issues with the system to the forefront through the use of media, because Saturn would be in the third house from Capricorn and also, I guess, in the third house from Pluto. We talked about in the horoscope how Jupiter and Venus were really supporting Saturn through this Pisces stay, but I think sometimes what can come with the Jupiter-Venus support of Saturn in such a condition like that is that like the news or the information about something can be downplayed to a certain degree, or feeling really optimistic about something when we really shouldn't. There's a bigger problem at hand that maybe is getting obscured.
I think that's a good thing to point out, actually, that sort of third house relationship with Capricorn that Saturn is in. If you think Capricorn is a place where we define reality tangibly by objective, measurable indicators, Saturn is great at that in Capricorn, but in Pisces, it's not really what, there aren't a lot of measuring sticks or well-calibrated scales in Pisces to measure such things. So off the jump, we're not getting great indicators for being able to identify those things, having reliable indicators for what the actual state of things are. What is the state of that decay that that Pluto is, generating terror and horror about? So I think we're in for, some maybe confusion about what the actual substantial reality behind maybe some of the stories that are getting shared and circulated are. It's notable that this is also, 28 degrees Capricorn is the degree of Mars's exaltation. So Mars loves it there. It has particularly, awesome results when it's there. Thinking about it that way, there is something worth fighting for here. When you're at the end of Capricorn, the cushion in your knees is gone. There are potentially identifiable points that could, when attacked, turn the whole system over, which if you are an attacker, knowing those points is really useful to conserve your resources and maybe use limited resources effectively to just attack those points. But also if you're defending, those are the points you need to reinforce and protect to the death, because those points equal the death of the system. So we don't really get a lot suggesting clarity on that, especially Mars is going to go retrograde, opposing Pluto in Cancer, where it tends to be a little confused. I think it'll be at its degree of maximum fall when it opposes Pluto. So we might, due to confusion or due to maybe irrational or highly subjective opinions about maybe where those weak spots are, misdirect our forces. We may not allocate those properly, and we may suffer the collapse of some institutions as a result.
Yeah. And of course, we're speaking about this whenever we're talking about outer planets, we're really talking about the broader landscape. So
Yes.
or average lives, probably not that big of a thing, but or average lives sit within the larger context. So it
Yeah.
will affect the overall landscape. But on that note, just to close this up, is there any advice that you'd give people about thinking about this Pluto re-ingress into Capricorn? I think for me personally, I'm just thinking about the Saturn in the third house relationship to it. It's news about this thing are not very reliable. So maybe don't stress about it too much, because to begin with, no one really knows what's going on.
Yeah. I would say, think about why Mars kicks so much ass there. Mars in Capricorn, and especially at its degree of exaltation, is pretty cool headed. Doesn't react to intimidation or to maybe fear mongering, or just is not emotionally reactive. It pays close attention to what is actually known about a situation and responds to it accordingly, and doesn't get baited into reacting irrationally. When in doubt, lean on the conservative side, maybe, or don't act unless you know that victory is assured. When in doubt, just don't. Maybe be my advice.
I love that. That feels very Saturnine as well.
Yeah.
So I feel like this is a good way to close it. I think that this is the vibe of this Pluto and Capricorn ordeal. A lot of confusing things going on, a lot of death and decay, but that's Pluto. What could you expect?
Will affect things on a very broad level, but probably not super fast. And, the world changes, and we just have to adapt and change with it.
Well,
Don't panic.
Happy Monday, guys.
Yeah, happy Monday. I'd love to say, oh, it's fine, but some change is both for the better and for the worse. So it's okay when things change. It just is. You'll be okay, most likely.